A woman of 58 knelt in snow up to her wrists, digging for something the whole valley swore could not exist. Green, in the dead heart of winter. Her fingers had gone past aching hours ago. Now they simply obeyed. Scrape, lift, search. The wind came down off the ridge like it had a grudge, and it found every gap in her coat, every year in her bones. Behind her stood the wall, 8 feet of red stone, curved like a closing hand, the strangest thing anyone in that town had ever seen built by a woman her age. They had laughed when she hauled the first block up the slope alone. They had stopped laughing when the laughing got too cold. She did not dig for them. She dug because a sick man lay in the cabin behind her, because the shelves were nearly bare, and because something deep in the dark soil had begun to breathe warmth back at her when the rest of the world had none to give. Her glove closed around a single pale leaf. Alive. Impossibly, stubbornly alive. She held it against her chest and did not move for a long moment. Outside the wall, the cold could kill a grown man by morning. Inside it, she was growing the one thing winter had promised her she never could. And the valley had no idea what was coming. The wind came first. It always did, in that valley. It rolled down from the high ridges before the sun had fully cleared them, and it carried the kind of cold that settled into a person and stayed. Not sharp, not loud, just patient. The kind of cold that waited. A woman stood at the edge of a dry gulch, watching it move across the basin floor. Her name was Addie Vance, and she was 58 years old. She had not come to this place to start over. A person did not start over at her age. That was what people said anyway. That was what the town would say soon enough. But here she was. Beside her stood her husband Wendell, a tall man once, still tall, though the years had begun to fold him inward, the way a long winter folds a fence post. He looked out at the land they had just bought, and said nothing. There was nothing kind to say about it. The soil was thin and pale, streaked through with red stone too close to the surface. The grass grew in stubborn little clumps, as if even the grass had thought twice about staying. And the wind never seemed to stop. A man on a gray horse had walked them across it that first afternoon. His name was Calder, and he owned most of what a person could see from that ridge. He spoke about the land the way a doctor speaks about something that cannot be cured, plainly, without softness. The growing season was short, he said. The ground gave back almost nothing. Most folks who tried to farm it left within a year, if they lasted that long. He paused then, just slightly, as if a thought had brushed past him. There were folks here once, he said, long before the town. Came with nothing. Tried to make this ground feed them through a winter. He looked off toward the cliff. It didn't end well. Nobody much remembers them now. He said it like a warning, or a fact. Addie could not tell which, but the words stayed with her, the way the cold stayed. Folks here once. It didn't end well. He did not smile when he said any of it. That was the part that stayed with her most. A cruel man would have smiled. Calder simply named the price, low enough that 2 people with almost nothing left could afford it, and watched her face to see what she would do. Addie said they would take it. Wendell looked at her like she had lost something he could not name, but he did not argue. He had stopped arguing with her years ago. Somewhere across all the miles behind them, the rail camps and the borrowed rooms and the long roads that led nowhere in particular, he trusted her, even now, even here. That was the thing about Wendell Vance. He had spent a lifetime reading land the way other men read weather signs, and he had learned that the things worth having were rarely the things that looked easy. But this looked like nothing at all. And then Addie turned her head and saw the cliff. It rose behind the gulch on the southeastern edge of the property. A long wall of red sandstone, weathered smooth in places, jagged in others. The whole valley had already fallen into shadow, gone blue and gray with the coming evening. But not the cliff. The cliff still held the light. It glowed a deep, warm copper in the last of the sun, as though it had soaked up the whole day and refused, quietly, to let it go. She stood very still. "That rock," she said softly. "It's holding the day longer than the ground is." Wendell followed her gaze. He did not understand yet. Few people would. But Addie felt something turn over inside her, the way the soil turns when a blade finally finds the soft place beneath the crust. The valley was cold. The cliff was not. And she could not stop looking at it. That first winter taught her everything she had been too hopeful to expect. It came down hard and early. The garden they had scratched into the earth froze before it could give them anything. The seed rose vanished beneath a crust of ice. And the wind, that endless wind, crossed the basin at angles that made no sense, piling snow against the wall of red stone in long, curving drifts. Most people would have read those drifts as a warning. Addie read them as a question, because she noticed something. The snow did not melt evenly. Near the dark face of the cliff, it thinned first. Some mornings, the ground beside the stone stayed soft long after the rest of the basin had gone hard as iron. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, she walked out to the cliff alone. The cold was bitter. Her breath hung white in front of her. The whole world was locked and silent and gray. She reached out and pressed her bare hand flat against the stone. It was warm, not much, not enough to comfort a body, but warm when everything around it was not. She stood there a long time, her hand against the rock, feeling the faint heat the cliff had carried through the night, like a secret it had not meant to share. And a thought arrived, quiet, stubborn, the kind of thought that changes a life without asking permission. Maybe surviving a winter like this was not about making more heat. Maybe it was about finding where heat refused to die. The town found out about the Vances soon enough. It was a small place, the kind where a stranger's business became everyone's by Sunday. And the story they settled on was simple: an aging couple, a worthless piece of ground, a woman foolish enough to think she could pull a living out of stone. A rancher named Boone said it loudest. He was a broad man with a loud laugh, the kind who needed an audience the way other men needed air. Outside the general store one cold afternoon, he told anyone who would listen that the old woman up at the gulch was fixing to grow her supper out of canyon walls. The men around him laughed. They laughed the way people do when someone else looks likely to fail first. It made the cold feel a little further away. It made their own thin harvests feel a little less thin. Addie heard about it. Of course she did. She did not answer it. She had learned, somewhere in all those years behind her, that the loudest mockery usually came from the most frightened place. A man did not laugh that hard at a thing he was sure of. So, she let them laugh. And she kept walking out to the cliff every evening, with a strip of cloth tied to a stick, watching the way the wind bent around the curve of the canyon wall, folding back on itself, breaking apart, softening, just there, in the lee of the stone. She was beginning to see a shape in it. She could not have explained it to anyone in that town. They would not have listened. But the land was speaking to her, and she was, at last, beginning to understand the language. One evening, as the light went copper on the cliff face and the cold came down off the ridge, Wendell came out to stand beside her. He moved slower than he used to. She had noticed that. She tried not to. He looked at the wall of stone for a long while. Then he said, the only thing that mattered. "You see something out here," he said. "Don't you?" It was not a question. Addie did not take her eyes off the cliff. "I see where the winter loses its grip," she said. The wind pushed against them both, cold and old and certain. But the stone behind them held its quiet heat, long after the rest of the valley had given up the day. And somewhere in that warmth, in that single stubborn place where the cold could not quite reach, a woman the world had already counted out began to imagine a wall that no one believed she could build. The idea did not arrive all at once. True things rarely do. It came to her in pieces, over many cold evenings, the way a slow thaw works its way down into frozen ground, one patient inch at a time. She would stand at the foot of the cliff as the light went out of the day, and she would watch the wind do the same thing it always did. It came down off the high ridge in a hard, straight line, and then it met the curve of the canyon wall. And it broke. It folded back on itself. It lost its temper and its strength against the old red stone, and in the lee of that curve, the air went soft and slow and almost gentle. The snow did not blast through there. It settled. It lay down in long, curving drifts, the way a tired animal lies down at last. Addie watched this for weeks. She did not yet know what she was looking at. She only knew that the land was trying to tell her something, and that she had spent a lifetime learning to listen to things that did not use words. Then, one evening, she understood. She crouched in the frozen dirt outside the cabin with a dead willow stick in her hand, and she began to draw. Not a straight line, not a fence, not the kind of wall a sensible person builds. A curve, wide in the middle, narrow at the open end, bent toward the southeast, toward the warm copper face of the cliff, like a pair of cupped hands held up to catch something falling out of the sky, like a horseshoe. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long, long time. The wind pulled at the loose gray hair around her face, and the cold worked its way up through the soles of her boots, and she did not move. A wall of red stone, taller than a tall man, curved to break the wind the way the canyon broke the wind. A wall that would not stand against the winter and fight it head on. Because nothing that stood and fought the winter head on ever won. A wall that would bend it, turn it, send it folding back on itself, so that the air trapped inside the curve would go still and settle and hold the heat the stone gave back after dark. It was the strangest idea she had ever had in 58 years of living, and she had never been more certain of anything. Wendell found her there in the morning. The drawing was still scratched into the dirt. Frost gathered white in its grooves like the lines on an old man's hand. He stood over it a long while. He had spent his life reading Land, this tall and folding man, and he understood before she said a single word what she was reaching for. She watched his eyes move along the curve, slow and careful, the way they used to move across a stretch of unbroken country. "That's a lot of stone," he said quietly. "It is. That's a lot of stone for two people who aren't young anymore." She got to her feet. She brushed the frost from her knees. "Then we'd best start early," she said. And something in his face, something that had been folding inward for a long time, straightened just a little. They started the next morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge. The cliff did not give up its stone for free. It had to be coaxed loose with iron wedges and a long-handled hammer, the kind of work that asks a body for everything it has, and then leans in close and asks again. Some pieces split clean along seams the eye could not see. Others shattered without warning and went tumbling down the slope through the loose gravel and frost. And a person had to be quick on her feet, even an old person, even a tired one. Addie swung the hammer. Her shoulders learned a new kind of ache that first week. Her hands cracked and bled along the knuckles, and she bound them in strips of cloth and swung the hammer anyway. There was no one to swing it for her. Wendell set the wedges. He worked the lever, but he tired so quickly now. She saw it, the way he had to stop and lean against the stone, the way his breath came short and ragged in the cold air, in long white clouds, too many of them, too fast, the way his hand pressed sometimes flat against his own chest, and then dropped away, as if he had decided it was nothing worth mentioning. She noticed every time she said nothing. He would not have wanted her to. There are men who would rather be broken than be pitied. And she had married one of them. And she had loved him for 40 years, exactly as he was. They had an old mule to haul the blocks down the slope, a patient, half-blind creature with a gray muzzle and a long memory for cruelty he had clearly known before he came to them. He pulled the stone sleds on rawhide runners that screamed across the frozen ground every time a load shifted sideways. Addie talked to him as she worked, low and steady, the way she talked to the wind, the way she talked to her own tired hands. And block by block, the wall began to rise below the cliff, not straight, curved, wide through the center, where the trapped air could settle and go still, narrow at the southeastern mouth, where the low winter sun would slip in across the short afternoons, thicker along the northwestern spine, where the worst of the wind came down off the high country with a sound like something hunting. It was slow. It was brutally, impossibly slow. And the town watched. They came up the road sometimes in twos and threes, on some invented errand that always seemed to lead past the foot of her slope. They stood at a careful distance and watched the gray-haired woman lift stone like a person half her age, and they did not offer to help, and they did not expect her to last out the month. A rancher named Boone came too. He was a broad-shouldered man with a loud, easy laugh, the kind of man who needed an audience the way other men need air to breathe. He rode up one cold afternoon and sat his horse at the bottom of the slope and looked up at the half-built curve of red stone with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "You building a wall up there," he called, "or digging a grave?" A few men had ridden up with him. They laughed. Addie set down her hammer. She looked at Boone for a long moment, the wind pulling at her hair, her bound hands hanging loose at her sides. "Depends," she said, "on who's still standing come spring." Then she bent and picked the hammer back up and swung it. Stone cracked. Boone stopped laughing. He sat there a moment longer, his face working through something he plainly did not want to feel. Then he wheeled his horse and rode back down the road faster than he had come up it. Wendell, leaning against the wall to catch his breath, watched him go. "You shouldn't poke at a man like that," he said. "He poked first." Wendell almost smiled. The cold made it hard. "Yeah," he said. "He did." When the wall stood high enough to matter, Addie understood she would need tools the land could not give her. Narrow blades for cutting the drainage channels, shallow hose for turning warm soil without dragging up the cold beneath it. Iron shaped for purposes no farmer in that valley had ever asked for. So she went down to the smithy at the edge of the town. The man who worked there was named Eli, a quiet, careful man with forge light in his eyes and a stillness about him that Addie liked at once. She spread her drawings across his workbench, and he studied them while the heat rolled through the dim shop in slow waves. He did not laugh. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He frowned at the strange shapes, and he turned the drawings toward the firelight, and he was quiet a long time. "These aren't farming tools," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "They're not." "What are they for?" "For bending winter," she said, "instead of breaking my back against it." From the back room came the sound of coughing. A woman appeared in the doorway, a blanket drawn around her thin shoulders. Cora, Eli's wife. The cough had clearly lived in her chest a long while. There was a grayness to her that Addie recognized, the particular gray of a body gone too long without anything green, without anything fresh, on a diet of salt and meal through the long, dark months. Cora looked at the drawings on the bench. Then she looked at Addie. "They say you're trying to grow food out of stone," she said. "They say a lot of things. Is it true?" Addie held her eyes. "It will be," she said. Cora was quiet a moment. Something moved behind her tired face. Something it cost her to feel. "I'd give near anything," she said softly, "for something green to eat before the thaw." The smithy went quiet, except for the breathing of the fire. Eli set down the drawings. He looked at his wife in the doorway, wrapped in her blanket, gray and thin and waiting. Then he looked back at Addie. "I'll make your tools," he said. "You bring us part of the first harvest, if there is one." "There be one," Addie said, and as she walked back up the road with the promise of iron behind her, she carried Cora's face with her the whole way. The gray of it, the hope she had been afraid to let into her voice. Addie was not building this wall only for herself anymore. She had not known that until that moment. The first true blow came on a night that had no business being so cruel. The afternoon had been mild, almost gentle, the kind of false warmth the high country sometimes offers, like a promise it has no intention of keeping. By then, Addie had built her first growing frames, low cedar boxes set against the inner curve of the wall, covered with thin muslin cloth she had soaked in boiled oil until it turned stiff and faintly amber and let the pale light through. And beneath that cloth, in soil she had hauled by the bucket and warmed and coaxed and prayed over, the first shoots had come up out of the dark. Green. The first green that ground had seen in a full turn of the seasons. She had knelt beside those frames the evening before and felt something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. Hope. It is a dangerous thing, hope. It opens a person up. It leaves a soft, undefended place. And the cold always knows where the soft places are. That night, the cold found it. The mild air turned while they slept. The warmth drained out of the world fast and silent, and the moisture that had risen warm and damp beneath the muslin met the freezing cloth, and turned to frost, and then to ice. By dawn, the inside of every frame was glazed white. Addie found them at first light. She knelt in the snow and lifted the stiff muslin with both hands, and underneath, the shoots stood frozen upright in their neat rows, still perfect, still green, caught mid-reach, as if they had been trying to climb up out of the cold at the very moment it took them. Dead. Every single one. For a long while, she did not move. The wind came down off the ridge and pulled at her coat, and she knelt there in the gray light with her hands full of ruined cloth and her breath hanging white before her, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. The weeks of hauling stone, the bleeding hands, the aching back, Cora's gray and hopeful face, Eli's iron forged on the strength of a promise, the town's laughter and Calder waiting somewhere below with his patient, certain eyes, all of it, frozen into a single tray of dead green shoots. And that was the moment the second blow fell. Not from the weather, from inside her own home. She heard him before she saw him. A sound from the cabin. Wrong. A short, choked cry. And then a heavy, terrible silence. Addie was on her feet and moving before she had decided to. She found Wendell on the floor beside the cold stove. He had gone down hard. His face was the color of ash, gray going toward something worse, and his hand was pressed flat against his chest, and his eyes, when they found her, were full of an apology he could not get his breath to say. Wendell! She was on her knees beside him. She got an arm beneath his shoulders. He was so heavy and so light at once, this tall man, folding now all the way down. "I'm all right," he managed. It was a lie, and they both knew it. "Just give me a minute. Just a minute, Addie." She got him to the bed. She built the fire up high. She sat beside him through the long gray morning with his cold hand in hers, and she watched the color come back into his face by slow, grudging degrees, and she did not let him see how badly her own hands were shaking. By afternoon, he could sit up. By evening, he could speak in something near his ordinary voice, but something had changed, and both of them knew it. A door had been shown to her. pushed open just a crack, enough to feel the cold draft of what waited on the other side. He would not be lifting stone again. Not this winter. Maybe not ever. That night, he reached for her hand in the dark. "Maybe the town's right," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Maybe we're too old for this, Addie. Maybe it's time to let the land go back to Calder and—" No, just that. Quiet, certain. The word fell into the dark like a stone into still water. "We're not too old," she said. "We were wrong about the frames, that's all. And wrong I can fix. But I won't fix it lying down. And neither will you." He was silent a moment. "You can't lift that stone alone," he said. "Then I'll lift it slow." She felt him turn his head toward her in the dark. "You'd carry the whole of it," he said. "Wouldn't you? Just so I don't have to admit I can't." She brought his hand up to her chest, the way she had held that single green leaf, the way she had wanted to hold every fragile thing she had ever been afraid to lose. "There was never a bargain, Wendell," she said softly. "There was you, and there was me, and there was a long road behind us. That's not a bargain. That's a marriage. I carry what needs carrying, same as you did, all those years, when it was your turn." In the dark, she heard him swallow. "I've watched you my whole life," he said at last. "You don't try. You finish." She held his hand against her heart and did not answer. Outside, the wind moved along the curve of the stone she had built, and inside, two old people lay in the dark and held on. In the morning, Addie climbed the slope alone. The hammer was heavier than it had been. Everything was heavier now. But she set the first wedge, and she swung, and the stone cracked, and she hauled it to the sled herself and talked the old mule down the slope with her own voice, and she did not stop until the light failed. The town saw her up there. One woman, alone, lifting stone against the white sky. They were certain now. A sick husband. A widow in all but name soon enough. A foolish old woman building a monument to her own stubbornness, stone by stone, while everything around her died. But Addie was not building a monument. She had gone back to the dead frames first thing, before the hammer, before anything. And this time she did not curse them. She studied them. She pressed her fingers into the soil and found it damp. Damper than it should have been. She lifted the frozen muslin and held it up to the cold light, and she saw the fine crust of ice on its underside, where the warm, wet breath of the soil had risen, met the freezing cloth, and wept itself into frost. The frames had not failed because the idea was wrong. They had failed because she had built a thing that breathed out and never breathed in. She had trapped the moisture with nowhere for it to go. She sat back on her heels in the snow, and slowly the grief in her chest turned into something else. A question. And a question, she had learned across a long and difficult life, was a thing a person could work with. Grief just sat on the chest like a stone. But a question had a door in it. So she tore the frames apart, and she built them again. This time she cut low vents into the boxes, small gaps near the base, so the warm, wet air could rise and slip out before it froze against the cloth. She dug shallow channels beneath the soil so the meltwater would have somewhere to run. She made the frames breathe in and out the way a living thing breathes. She made them out of almost nothing, because almost nothing was what she had. Calder rode up the slope a few days later. He did not dismount. He sat his gray horse and looked at the half-finished wall and the rebuilt frames and the woman working alone with no man beside her, and he reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper. A debt, the money borrowed against the land. The balance had come due far faster than two people with nothing could ever hope to meet. "The account's behind," he said. No anger in it, no pleasure. Just the flat, plain certainty of a man stating the time of day. "If it isn't settled by the thaw, the land comes back to me." Addie straightened slowly. She set her hands at the small of her aching back. "And you'd like that," she said. "Wouldn't you?" Something crossed Calder's face, quick, buried almost before it surfaced. "I'd like to be paid," he said, and he turned the horse and rode back down. But Addie had seen it, that flicker, and she had spent a lifetime trusting the things people tried hardest not to show. There was something Calder wasn't saying about this land, not a thing he wanted from it, a thing he knew about it, something behind that patient, certain face, the look of a man who had watched this ground beat someone before and meant to watch it happen again. She did not know the whole of it, not yet, but she filed it away, the way she filed away the bend of the wind and the warmth of the stone, a thing to be understood in time. She learned the next part of it the hard way. She went down to the town one cold morning to trade for seed, the way a person does when the planting season starts to whisper from somewhere under the frozen ground. And she found every door politely, regretfully closed. No seed to spare, they told her. So sorry, hard year, lean stores. You understand. She went from the general store to the feed merchant to two farms at the edge of town. The same closed door. The same careful, regretful faces that would not quite meet her eyes. And standing in the cold and empty street, she understood. Calder had not only called in a debt, in the quiet way of a man who liked his certainties stacked deep. He had gone around to every soul in that country who held seed worth planting, and he had bought it, all of it, at prices no struggling family could match, so that when the thaw came, and the planting season with it, there would be nothing in that whole valley for the Vances to put in the ground. He meant to starve the idea out of her. He meant to let the winter and the empty soil do the work, so he never had to be the villain who did it himself. She was being walked, slowly and deliberately, toward a wall with no door in it. And it was there, in that narrowing cold, that she found the last piece of the picture. Boone was at the general store that morning. She came out into the gray light, and there he was, the big rancher, leaning against the porch rail. And for once he was not laughing. He was talking, low and tight and fast, to the storekeeper. And Addie, passing close, caught one fragment of it before he heard her step. "Told Calder I'd have it by the thaw, but if the cattle don't come through, I don't know how a man's supposed to—" He stopped. He had seen her. For one bare second, the two of them looked at each other across the cold porch, and the loud, laughing man who had asked if she was digging her own grave was not there. In his place stood a frightened one, a man who owed the same gray-horsed creditor she did, a man whose cattle might not make it through, a man who laughed loudest at her failure because he could already feel his own coming up the road behind it, patient and certain and wearing Calder's face. His mockery had never been about her at all. It had been about the one thing he could not say out loud, that he might be next. Boone straightened. He reached for the old laugh. It would not come to him. His mouth worked, and nothing easy came out. "Mrs. Vance," he said at last, stiff and low, and he touched the brim of his hat, and he looked away. Addie said nothing. She held his eyes one moment longer, and there was no triumph in her, only a strange, quiet ache, because she saw, all at once, what the whole valley really was. Not a town of cruel people, a town of frightened ones. Every one of them was a single bad winter from the cold road she walked. They mocked her because she had dared to do the one thing they were all too afraid to try. She could not hate them for it, but she understood them now. And understanding, for Addie Vance, had always been the first true step toward winning. She walked back up the road to her cliff, and she went back to work. By the deepest part of that winter, the wall stood nearly complete. Red sandstone, curved like a closing hand, the strangest and most beautiful thing that Valley had ever seen rise from its thin and stubborn ground. She had built most of it alone. Her hands would carry the marks of it for the rest of her life, and she had learned to make it work. She moved through her evenings now with the focus of a woman running a machine she had built herself, piece by piece, out of every failure that had tried to break her. Each night after the sun went down, she carried small thermometers into the curve of the wall and set them in different places. One near the soil, one against the warm face of the cliff, one outside in the open basin, where the wind still cut freely across the snow. And then she waited. And the readings changed everything. Inside the wall, where the air went still and the stone gave back its borrowed heat, the temperature held warmer than the open basin. Not warm, but warmer. 8 degrees. 10, sometimes more, in the hours just after dark, when the cliff was still breathing out the day it had swallowed whole. She had not made heat. No one could make heat out of nothing. She had found where heat refused to die, and she had built a place to keep it. She knelt inside the wall one evening, with the wind hammering uselessly against the red stone at her back. Inside the curve, the air was nearly still. The rebuilt frames breathed quietly in their rows. And beneath the muslin, in the dark, warm soil, the second planting had begun to push up green again, stubborn, pale, alive. She pressed her fingers to the soil and felt the faint warmth still rising from it, the borrowed heat of a day the stone had refused to surrender to the night. Outside the wall, a grown man could freeze before morning. Inside it, something was growing. In the cabin behind her, a good man lay resting, alive, watching the firelight, waiting for her to come in from the cold. Below her, in the dark, a town of frightened people slept, certain she would fail. And somewhere down the valley, A careful man on a gray horse waited, patient as winter itself, for the thaw that he believed would hand him back this land. Addie looked up at the cliff, gone copper dark now in the last of the light, and she thought of every voice that had ever told her what she could not do. Too old, too foolish, too late. And she thought, with a quiet that was almost like joy, not too old, just early. The wall was holding, and the woman the whole world had already counted out was only just beginning to fight. She came out of the white like something the winter had decided to give back. Addie saw her first as a shape on the road, a small bent figure wrapped in so many layers of wool and hide that for a moment she might have been mistaken for a drift that had learned to walk. But she walked steady. That was the thing Addie noticed. The cold did not seem to touch the old woman the way it touched everyone else. She moved through it the way a fish moves through cold water, as if she belonged to it. She stopped at the foot of the slope, below the curving wall of red stone, and she stood there a long while without calling out, just looking. Her eyes moved slowly across the whole of it, the curved walls, the frames breathing quietly beneath their amber cloth, the narrow channel where water still moved beneath a skin of forming ice. She read it the way Addie read the wind, the way Wendell had once read open country. She read it, and she understood it. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry and cracked, like a hinge that had not been used in a long time. "You're not fighting the winter," the old woman said. "You're bending it." Addie set down her tools. In all the long cold months, in all the watching faces and closed doors and patient cruelty of that valley, no one outside her own home had understood what the wall was for. Not the town, not Boone, not even Eli quite, though he had come the closest. This stranger had understood it in a single glance. "Most folks," Addie said carefully, "just see a pile of rock." "Most folks," the old woman said, "see what they're afraid of, and call it the truth." She came up the slope then, slow, sure-footed. She gave her name as Marin, and she offered nothing else about herself. And Addie did not ask. There was a wandering kind of person who moved through that high country in the worst of the cold, trading what they knew for what they needed. Seeds, cures, old knowledge no one wanted until the night it saved their life. Marin was one of those. She stood inside the curve of the wall and held her cracked old hands out toward the frames, and something in her weathered face went soft and strange. "Warm," she murmured, "in here, with the whole world froze solid." "A little," Addie said. "Not enough yet." "Enough," Marin said, "is a word for people who've never been truly cold." From somewhere inside all those layers of wool, she drew out a small bundle, cloth packets tied with faded cord, worn soft with handling. She did not hand them over. She held them, and she looked at Addie with eyes that had seen a great deal more than they wanted to. "Seeds," she said, "the kind that don't quit. Greens that grow low and stubborn in the shade of cold stone. A bitter mustard that takes the frost and just gets sharper for it. Things that were bred, long ago, by people who had no choice but to make the cold feed them." Addie reached for them. Marin pulled them back. Just slightly. Just enough. "Not yet," she said. "There's a price." Addie waited. She had learned that the people most worth dealing with rarely wanted money. You write it down, Marin said. All of it. Every failure. Every fix. Every night the frames froze, and every morning you figured out why. Not just what works, why it works. You put it on paper, and you keep that paper, and you do not let it die with you. Addie frowned slightly. Why? The old woman's eyes went somewhere far away. Because knowledge dies faster than people do out here, she said. A person can live 80 years. But what they learned, that can die in an afternoon. One bad fever, one hard winter, and it's gone. All of it. Like it never was. Something in the way she said it made the back of Addie's neck go cold. This was not a general truth the old woman was speaking. This was a wound, but Marin said no more. She pressed the seed packets into Addie's hands, and she folded the woman's fingers closed around them with her own. And that was all. Write it down, she said again. Promise me that. I promise, Addie said, and she meant it. That night, the ledger changed. Until then, it had been a practical thing. Columns of numbers, wind directions, the temperature inside the wall and out, freeze times, the dry, careful records of a woman keeping track. But that night, by the low light of the stove, Addie began to write something else. Not just what had happened. Why? Why the moisture froze beneath the frames. Why the rigid clay of the channel had cracked under the cold, and the softer seams had not. Why the curve of the wall turned the wind, and a straight wall would have only gathered the snow against itself and buried everything she loved. Page after page. Not results. Understanding. Wendell watched her from the bed, propped on the pillows, his color better than it had been, but his strength still gone soft. You writing a book over there? He asked. I'm writing the why of things, she said, not looking up. So the next fool who tries this doesn't have to bleed for every answer the way I did. He was quiet a moment. The next fool, he said, or the next person smart enough to listen. She smiled at that, in the dark, where he could not see. The seeds went into the warmest soil, nearest the cliff, where the borrowed heat lingered longest after dark. And they took, slowly, stubbornly. The miner's greens spread low and flat across the warm gravel. The bitter mustard pushed up dark and tough beneath the amber cloth. For the first time, the inside of the wall began to look less like an experiment and more like a garden that had simply forgotten what season it was. Marin did not leave. She stayed on the edges of the homestead, in an old lean-to she patched herself, asking for almost nothing. She was useful in ways Addie had not expected. She knew which leaves to take and which to leave, so the roots would not weaken. She knew, by some sense Addie could not name, when a hard night was coming, hours before the sky gave any sign. But she kept herself apart. She watched the cliff a great deal. Addie would find her sometimes, standing at the foot of the red stone, her hand pressed flat against it, just standing there, just feeling the warmth the rock gave back. And her face, in those moments, was not the face of a stranger studying a curiosity. It was the face of someone visiting a grave. Addie said nothing. She had learned that some doors a person had to be allowed to open on their own. The cold that came next was the worst the wall had ever faced. It did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a decision. The mild days simply ended. The temperature fell away and kept falling, deeper than the basin had known all winter. And then it stayed there, hard and merciless, for days that ran into one another with no sun worth the name between them. The wall fought, but the cold was patient, and the cold was vast, and one by one the frames began to fail. The first morning, Addie found a corner of the eastern frames glazed white again. She fixed the vents, dug the channels deeper, fought it back. The second morning, the cold had pushed in further. The mustard along the outer edge had gone dark and flat and dead beneath a skin of ice. The third morning, the wind shifted, and it drove what little snow there was hard against the southeastern mouth of the wall, the very opening she had built to let the low sun in. And it began to drift closed. Hour by hour, the light that fed her garden narrowed, and the cold came in. She did not sleep. She worked through the dark with a lantern that the wind kept trying to kill, breaking ice from the channel, banking the frames, hauling what warmth she could from the cliff's stored heat into soil that drank it and asked for more. It was not enough. By the fourth morning, she stood inside her own wall and looked at row after row of frozen, blackened green, and felt the thing she had refused to feel all winter long finally take hold of her. Despair. The cold had simply been bigger than her. Bigger than the wall, bigger than the cleverness and the stubbornness and the bleeding hands. It had walked through everything she built as if she had built nothing at all. She sat down in the snow inside the curve of her own creation, and for a long while she did not get up. That evening, Wendell found her there. He had crossed the cold yard on legs that should not have carried him, leaning on a stick, and he lowered himself down into the snow beside her with a grunt that was half pain and half determination. "You'll catch your death out here," she said dully. "So will you." He looked at the ruined frames, at the black and frozen rows, at the wall she had nearly killed herself to raise. "It's a beautiful thing you built, Addie," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, it's the most beautiful thing I ever watched a person make." She did not answer. She was so tired, tired all the way down to the marrow, the kind of tired that whispers it would be so easy now to simply stop. It was Marin who broke the silence. She had come up without a sound, the way she always did, and she stood over the two of them in the failing light, a small dark shape against the white. "Get up," she said. Addie did not move. "It's gone," she said, "all of it. The cold took everything." Not everything. Something in the old woman's voice made Addie lift her head. Marin was not looking at the dead frames. She was looking past them to the lowest corner of the wall, the warmest spot, the place nearest the cliff where the stone gave back its heat the longest. "You learn to tell which ones live," Marin said softly, "by learning which ones died. Go look. You earned the right to look." Slowly, on legs gone numb beneath her, Addie rose. She crossed the snow. She knelt at the lowest frame, in the warmest corner. And with hands that shook, she lifted the frozen muslin. And there, in the center of all that death, one small sprout still stood, a single shoot of miner's green, tiny, pale, barely the length of a finger. Frost rimmed the edges of its leaves, and it stood crooked, and it looked like the most fragile thing in all the cold world. But it was alive. Addie stared at it. She could not breathe. She reached with numb and shaking fingers for the thermometer she had set beside that frame the night before. She brought it close to her eyes in the dying light. Inside the wall, 21 degrees. She turned. She looked at the one she had set outside the wall, in the open. She had to wipe the frost from the glass to read it. Outside, 22 degrees below nothing. The difference between those two numbers was more than 40 degrees. The difference between those two numbers was the whole of it, 40 degrees. The exact and narrow margin between a frozen black ruin and one small, stubborn, living thing. The wall worked, not perfectly. Not yet. The cold could still come for almost everything she grew, but in the warmest corner, in the heart of the curve, in the place where the stone gave back the most of the day it had swallowed, life held on, by a margin of almost nothing, and almost nothing was enough. Addie lowered herself down into the snow beside that single sprout, and she pressed the back of her cracked hand against the warm stone of the cliff, and she began, very quietly, to weep. Not because the harvest was saved. It was not. She wept because it had not stopped. Because in the worst the winter could throw, in the deepest cold the valley had, one living thing had refused to quit. The way she had refused. The way she always would. Behind her, Wendell reached out and laid his hand on her shoulder, and Marin stood over them both, looking down at the tiny living sprout, and the strangest expression moved across her ancient face. It was grief, and it was something that, after a very long time, had finally turned back into hope. "My people couldn't do it," Marin said. The words came out of her low and rough, as if they had been waiting many years for a reason to be spoken. Addie went still. "What?" Marin did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the small green sprout, on the warm red face of the cliff above it. "This land," she said, "this basin, this very ground you built your wall on." Her voice cracked. "A family lived here once, long before your time, before the town was what it is, before there were enough people to even remember them." And Addie remembered. Calder, that first afternoon, the gray horse, the flat, plain voice. There were folks here once. It didn't end well. The cold wind moved along the curve of the stone. "They came with nothing," Marin went on, "and they tried. God, how they tried. They saw the same thing you saw, the warmth in the cliff. They knew there was something here worth holding, but they couldn't reach it. They didn't have the knowing. The winter came, and it was a winter like this one. And they—" She stopped. She did not have to finish. Addie understood. She understood the closed doors of the town, and the cheap price Calder had named, and the patient certainty in his eyes. She understood why the land was cursed in the valley's memory, why no one had wanted it, why a careful man would sell it low and wait, sure as winter, for it to do to the Vances what it had done to the people before them. And she understood, at last, the old woman in front of her. "You were one of them," Addie whispered. Weren't you? Marin's eyes were wet. She did not wipe them. I was a child, she said, the only one who walked off this land. I've been moving ever since, camp to camp, cold place to cold place, trading what little I learned so it wouldn't die with me the way it died with them. She drew a slow, shaking breath. I told myself I'd never come back here. There was nothing here for me but the worst day of my life. She finally looked at Addie, full on, and then word came that some stubborn old woman was building a curved wall against the cliff, she said, bending the winter instead of breaking against it. And I had to come. I had to see. I had to know if a person could finally do the thing my family died trying to do. The wind died down to nothing. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath. Marin looked down at the single living sprout, frost on its leaves, standing crooked and alive in the warmest corner of the wall. And here it is, she said softly. After all these years, one green thing, alive, in the dead heart of the cold. A tear ran down into the deep lines of her face. My people didn't fail because they were weak, she said. They failed because they were first, because no one had figured it out yet, and because there was no one to tell them. Her old hand closed hard around Addie's wrist. That is why you write it down. Do you hear me? That is why. Addie covered the old woman's hand with her own. I hear you, she said. And in that moment, the ledger by the stove stopped being a record of one stubborn woman's strange ideas, and became a thing that reached backward across all those lost years, to a family that had died in the cold, with no one to remember what they had learned, and forward, toward whoever might one day need it, knowledge, refusing to die. The same stubbornness that had kept one small sprout alive through the killing cold, reaching now across 2 lifetimes toward whoever came next. They went inside. Addie carried the single sprout in its frame to the very warmest spot in the wall, and she banked it, and she watched over it like a woman watching over a fevered child. And in the days that followed, the cold loosened its grip, just slightly, just enough, and the green began slowly to come back. Not all of it. The cold had taken most, but enough remained that she could see now the shape of what was coming. The rose filling in, the mustard sharpening, the promise of something green and real before the thaw. The thing Cora had said she would give near anything for. Addie let herself believe, for the first time, that she might actually win. That was when Marin came to her, one gray morning, with the worst kind of news. The old woman had been standing at the cliff again, reading the sky in that way she had. And when she came down, her face was set hard. It's coming, she said. What is? Marin looked out across the basin, to the high ridges, to the strange flat color the sky had taken on. The big one, she said. The kind that only comes once in a long while. The kind that buries fence posts. The kind that takes the cattle standing up. She turned to Addie, and her eyes were grim. The kind that took my family. Addie felt the cold settle into her chest, not the cold of the air, the other kind. How long? 3 days, maybe less. Maren gripped her arm. Everything you mean to harvest, you harvest before it gets here. Everything you mean to save, you save now. Because once it comes down off that ridge. She did not finish. She did not have to. Addie looked up at her wall, at the green just beginning to come back, at the channel where the water still moved, at the cabin where a good man rested, alive, depending on her. And she thought of the family that had stood on this same ground, long ago, watching the same flat sky. The signs were already there, now that she knew to read them. The wind had shifted twice in a single afternoon. The air had gone strangely still before the sun went down, and the small birds that wintered along the fence lines had simply vanished. The whole world had gone quiet, the way a room goes quiet before something terrible is said. Addie rolled up her sleeves. Then we don't waste the daylight, she said, and she climbed the slope toward her wall one more time to make ready for the worst the winter had left to give. Behind her, the old woman stood a moment longer, looking at the cliff, at the basin, at the curving wall of red stone that her own family had not lived to build. Hold, Maren whispered, to the wall, to the woman, to the small green things fighting for their lives inside the curve. This time, she said, hold. And far up on the high ridge, where the flat gray sky met the frozen edge of the world, something began, slowly, to move. They harvested through the last of the daylight. Addie and Maren worked side by side inside the curve of the wall, cutting every leaf that was ready and many that were not quite, because a half-grown leaf in the hand was worth more than a perfect one buried under what was coming. Wendell helped from a stool they carried out for him. He could not bend or lift, but his hands still worked, and he sorted and bundled the greens with a slow, careful tenderness, as though each leaf were something rare, which, in that valley, in that season, it was. They worked until their fingers would not close. They worked until the light went out of the sky, not slowly the way it usually did, but all at once, swallowed early by the flat gray ceiling pressing down off the ridge. And then the wind came. It did not build the way ordinary wind builds. It arrived. One moment the air was still and waiting, and the next it came down off the high country with a long, low sound, like something vast drawing breath. And then it was on them. Maren got Wendell inside. Addie stood one moment longer at the mouth of the wall, the bundled greens clutched to her chest, and she watched the white come rolling down the slope toward her like a wave with no shore to break on. Then she turned, and she carried her harvest into the cabin, and she shut the door against the night. For a while, the wall did what she had built it to do. The wind struck the curved red stone and broke against it. It folded back on itself, the way the canyon had taught her it would, and inside the curve, the air stayed slower and warmer than the howling dark beyond. But this was not an ordinary night. By the deepest part of it, the storm had thrown so much snow against the southeastern mouth that the opening began to choke. And as the cold pressed in through the narrowing gap, the channel where the water moved began, for the first time all winter, to lose its fight. Maren felt it before Addie did. The old woman woke in the dark and sat up sharp. "The water's slowing," she said. "I can hear it." Addie was already pulling on her coat. "You stay with Wendell," she said. Keep the fire high. If that channel freezes solid, the cold gets under the whole garden, and everything we saved tonight dies anyway. You can't go out alone in that. I built it alone, Addie said. I'll keep it alone. Wendell's voice came from the bed, thin but fierce. Addie. She crossed to him. She took his face in her two cold hands. I'm not losing it now, she said. Not after everything. Not to one bad night. She kissed his forehead, and then she took up the lantern and the trench blade Eli had forged for her, and she went out into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall of its own. It took her breath. It found every gap, every year, every soft place. The wind tried 3 times to kill the lantern before she reached the wall, and she had to cup her body around it, shield it with her own back, fight her way forward into a white so thick she could not see her own feet. But she knew this ground. She had built every foot of it with her own bleeding hands, and her body knew the way the lantern could not light. She reached the channel, and her heart dropped. A skin of ice had formed across the moving water, thickening even as she watched, and where the channel narrowed near the basin, this cold had already pinched it nearly shut. If it closed, if the water stopped, the frozen plug would pull the heat out of the soil from below, the way it had failed once before, and there would be no fixing it until the thaw. By the thaw, everything would be dead. She dropped to her knees in the snow, and she went to work. She broke the ice with the back of the blade, swinging in the dark, the wind tearing the chips away before they landed. She cleared the narrow throat of the channel with her bare hands, plunging them into water so cold it stopped being cold and became a kind of fire. She could not feel her fingers. She used them anyway. She did not know how long she knelt there. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the dark, and the wind, and the water she had to keep moving, and the small, terrible voice inside her that whispered she was too old. She was too tired. She could not do this. No one could do this. Lie down, lie down, lie down. She did not lie down. She thought of the single green sprout that had refused to quit. She thought of a family long ago on this same ground, fighting this same cold, with no wall to shelter them and no knowing to save them. She thought of Wendell in the cabin, alive, waiting. And she broke the ice, and she cleared the throat, and she broke it again. Hour after hour, alone in the screaming dark, a 58-year-old woman on her knees in the snow, refusing the winter the one thing it wanted most, to stop her. When the first gray light came, the storm had not ended, but it had eased, and the water was still moving. Barely. A thin silver thread beneath a skin of ice she had not let close, but moving. Addie sat back on her heels in the snow, her hands no longer her own, her whole body shaking, and she looked at that thin moving thread of water, and she began, helplessly, to laugh. It came out cracked and broken and half a sob. But it was a laugh. She had held. That was when she heard it, beneath the wind, faint but real. A sound that did not belong to the storm. A knock. Someone was at the stone gate. Addie hauled herself up on legs that did not want to hold her, and she made her way to the mouth of the wall, and she pulled back the heavy plank she used to close it against the night. A figure stood there in the white, bent against the wind, wrapped in a man's heavy coat that was far too big. It was Cora, Eli's wife, the gray-faced woman who had said, in the warm dark of the smithy, that she would give near anything for something green before the thaw. She had walked through the storm to get here. "I'm sorry," Cora said. Her lips were blue. She could barely form the words. "I'm sorry to come like this. In this. But the children." Her voice broke. "The children haven't had anything fresh in so long. And the littlest one's gone so pale. And I remembered what you said, that there'd be a harvest." Addie did not hesitate. She did not think of the closed doors of the town. She did not think of the laughter, or the long cold months of being the valley's fool. She took Cora's frozen hands in hers, and she pulled her in out of the wind. "Come inside the wall," she said. "Get warm, and then you'll take greens home to those children. As much as you can carry." Cora stared at her. "After how this town treated you," she whispered, "you'd still—" "Hush now," Addie said gently. "A child shouldn't pay for what grown folks were too scared to understand. Come in." And she brought her in out of the cold. Cora was the first. She was not the last. Word of green food in the dead of that storm moved through the buried valley the way warmth moves through frozen ground. Slow. And then, all at once. By the time the worst of the wind had passed, and the snow had settled into long, silent drifts that swallowed the fences whole, they began to come, one by one, up the slope, through the snow, to the stone gate of the woman they had all been so certain would fail. The pastor's wife came, a thin, proud woman who had sat in the front pew while her husband warned the whole congregation about people who mistook stubbornness for wisdom. She stood at the gate now with her head bowed, and she could not quite meet Addie's eyes, and she said only that her husband had taken a fever, and there was nothing fresh in the house to bring his strength back. Addie gave her greens. She did not say a word about the sermons. She simply wrapped the greens in cloth and pressed them into the woman's hands, and told her to keep the pastor warm and to come back if she needed more. The pastor's wife began to cry, right there at the gate. "I don't understand you," she said. "You don't have to," Addie said softly. "You just have to feed your husband." And then Boone came, the big rancher who had asked if she was digging her own grave. He came on foot, his horse no use in the drifts, and the snow had frozen in his beard, and the loud, easy laughter was gone from him entirely, scoured away by something Addie recognized at once: fear for a child. "It's my girl," he said. The words came out of him in pieces. "My youngest. She's gone weak. Won't hardly stand. Her gums." He stopped. He looked at the ground. A big, proud man, brought all the way down. "Somebody said it's the kind of sick that comes from no fresh food. Said you can't fix it with meal and salt. Said you need green things." He forced himself to look up at her. "I know what I called you," he said. "I know what I said on that slope. I got no right to be standing here." Addie looked at him a long moment, and she thought of the porch and the fragment she had overheard. "Told Calder I'd have it by the thaw." She thought of a man laughing loudest at her failure, because he could feel his own coming up the road behind it. She had understood him then, and she understood him now. "Your girl didn't call me anything," Addie said. "Wait here." She went into the wall, and she cut a generous bundle of the mustard and the miner's greens, and she came back and pressed it into the rancher's big, rough hands. "You feed her a little at a time," she said. "Cooked soft the first day or two. Her body's forgotten what green is. Don't rush it." Boone stared at the greens in his hands as if they were made of gold. "Why?" he said. His voice was thick. "After everything. Why would you—" "Because you were never laughing at me, Boone," Addie said quietly. "You were laughing because you were scared. Scared you'd end up just like the foolish old woman on the hill. And now, here you are. And here I am. And your girl needs to eat." She closed his hands around the greens. "That's all that matters now. Go home." The big man's shoulders shook. He turned and he went down the slope through the snow, clutching the greens to his chest like the most precious thing he had ever carried. And it was. All through that long gray day, they came. The footprints beat a path through the snow, up the slope, to the stone gate. People who had laughed. People who had closed their doors. People who had sat in the pews and nodded along at sermons about pride. And Addie turned none of them away. She did not lecture. She did not gloat. She did not make a single one of them say they were sorry. She simply fed them. Because somewhere in the long cold of that winter, between the failures and the frozen frames, and the single sprout that would not quit, she had understood something the whole valley was only now beginning to learn. That the wall had never really been about vegetables. It had been about this, a place where the cold could not reach. A place that gave back warmth when the whole world had none to spare. A place built by a woman everyone had counted out. That was now, in the worst night the valley had ever known, the one place left that could keep them all alive. Marin stood beside her through it, helping cut and wrap and carry, and once, watching another family go down the slope with their arms full of green, the old woman said, very quietly, "My people would have wept to see this." Addie put an arm around her thin shoulders. "Your people," she said, "are the reason any of these folks ate today. You carried the knowing all those years. You brought it here. You made me write it down." She held her tight. "They didn't fail, Marin. They just had to wait a long time for someone to finish it." The old woman leaned into her and said nothing, but the tears on her face said enough. The last knock came after dark. The storm had spent itself by then. The wind had dropped to a low, exhausted moan, and the snow fell soft and straight in the lantern light, and the whole buried valley lay silent and white and strange. Addie almost did not hear it, but it came again, slow, heavy. A man's fist against the plank of the gate. She pulled it back, and there, in the falling snow, stood Calder, the man on the gray horse, the man who had named the cheap price and watched her face, the man who had called in the debt and bought up every seed in the valley and waited, patient as winter, for this land to do to her what it had done to the family before. He was on foot now, his horse useless in the drifts, same as everyone's. and there was snow frozen across his shoulders, and his careful, certain face had come apart at last, and he looked, standing there in the cold light, like nothing so much as a frightened old man. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them. "My grandchild," Calder said finally. The words came out of him rough and strange, as if he had forgotten how to ask for anything. "A little one, staying at my place for the winter. The fever came 2 days back, and it won't break. And there's no fresh food in that whole house. And the boy's getting weaker. And He stopped. He looked at the wall behind her, at the warm glow of the lantern within it, at the green he could surely smell, even from the gate, in the dead heart of all that cold. And something terrible and human moved across his face. "I know what I did," he said. "I know what I tried to do to you. I bought the seed. I called the debt. I sold you this land, hoping it would—" His voice failed. "I sold you this land because I was certain it would kill the both of you, same as it killed the folks before. And I'd have let it. God help me, I'd have let it, and called it business." He looked down at the snow. "I got no right to stand at this gate," he said. "No right at all. But the boy's just a child, and he's sick. And you're the only soul in this whole frozen valley who's got a green thing growing." He could barely get the last of it out. "So I'm asking, I'm begging, anything at all." Addie looked at him for a long, long time. This was the man who had tried to break her, who had set the closed doors against her, who had watched and waited and meant for her to die out here the way a family had died before. She had every right in the world to send him back down the slope empty-handed. The town would have understood. Marin would have understood. Even Wendell, gentle as he was, might have closed the gate. But Addie thought of a small, sick child she had never met, lying somewhere in the dark, weak and feverish, who had done nothing to anyone. And she thought of the thing she had built, not the stone, the other thing, the warmth that gave back when the world gave nothing. She would not let it become a wall that judged who deserved to be warm. "Come in," she said. Calder's head came up. "What?" "Come in out of the cold," Addie said. "Sit by the frames a minute and get your blood moving, and then I'll cut you greens for the boy and tell you how to cook them so his body can take them, and you'll go home and you'll feed your grandchild." Calder stared at her. He could not seem to understand the words. "After what I did," he said. "After what you did," Addie agreed. She stepped aside and held the gate open and let the warmth spill out into the snow toward him. "A wall that only keeps out the people who wronged you," she said quietly, "isn't worth the stone it's made of. I didn't build mine to keep anybody out, Calder. Not even you. Now come in. Your grandbaby's waiting." The hard, careful man who had owned half of everything a person could see from that ridge stood at the gate of a woman he had tried to destroy and broke. He put his snow-crusted hand over his face, and his shoulders shook, and he wept the way only a proud man weeps, with shame and relief all tangled up together. And Addie Vance, who had been called too old and too foolish and too late, who had built a wall with her own bleeding hands while a whole valley laughed, reached out and took the arm of the man who had wronged her most and drew him in out of the cold. Inside the wall, the lantern glowed warm and gold. The green grew in its quiet rows. The water moved in the channel she had nearly died to keep open. And the worst night the valley had ever known passed, hour by hour, into a gray and silent dawn. With every soul who had come to that stone gate going home alive and warm and carrying in their arms the impossible thing, something green, in the dead heart of winter. When the light finally came, Addie stood atop the curve of her own wall and looked down at the buried world. The fences were gone. The trails were gone. The whole valley lay white and silent and new, as if the storm had wiped the slate of it clean. But there, in all that blankness, ran a single mark, a path, beaten into the snow by many feet, winding up the slope from every corner of the valley, from the town, from the far farms, from the big house on the ridge, all of it, leading to one place, her stone gate. The whole valley had carved a new road through the snow that night, and every foot of it led to the small pocket of warmth a woman they had counted out had built against a cliff that everyone said was good for nothing. Wendell came out to stand beside her, leaning on his stick, wrapped against the cold. He followed her gaze down to the path in the snow, and he was quiet a long while. "You see that?" he said finally. "I see it. That's not a path to a wall, Addie." His voice was rough. "That's a path to you." She did not answer. She slipped her arm through his, and the two of them stood together atop the curve of red stone she had raised against the winter. Two old people. The world had been so sure were finished, and they watched the sun come up gold and cold over the buried valley. The storm was over. The wall had held. And somewhere down that single winding path, in warm kitchens all across the valley, children who had gone pale and weak were eating something green and growing strong again. The thaw came slowly that year, not all at once, not with any softness. The snow simply loosened its grip a little at a time, the way a hard season finally lets go of a person, until the buried fences showed their tops again, and the trails came back, and the valley remembered its own shape. And the valley that came out from under the snow was not the same valley that had gone in. Something had changed in it. People who had laughed now looked away when Addie passed on the road. Not out of scorn, out of shame, and out of something quieter and harder to name. A kind of awe, maybe. The look people get when they have seen a thing they were certain could not be done by the very person they were certain could not do it. The pastor, recovered from his fever on a diet of green things from her wall, stood before his congregation one Sunday and spoke about pride, but not the way he had before. He did not warn them about people who mistook stubbornness for wisdom. He spoke instead about the danger of being so sure of what could not be done that a person stopped looking at what was being done right in front of them. He did not say her name. He did not have to. Every soul in that room had walked the path through the snow to her gate. Every one of them had carried something green home in their arms. They knew exactly who he meant. Addie did not go to hear it. She heard about it later, from Cora. She only nodded and went back to her work and felt no triumph at all. Vindication, she had learned, was a thin and tasteless thing. It did not warm a person the way the wall did. Wendell grew stronger as the days lengthened. Not strong. He would never again be the tall, striding man who had read Open Country like a book. The winter had taken something from him that did not come back, but he could walk the slope now, slow, leaning on his stick, and sit beside her while she worked, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Some evenings she would find him at the foot of the cliff, his hand pressed flat against the warm red stone. Still warm, he would say, wonderingly. Even now, after all of it. It always was, Addie would answer. We just had to learn how to keep it. And he would smile at her, this man she had crossed a lifetime with. And there was something in his eyes that had not been there before the winter. It looked a great deal like peace. But peace, in that valley, never lasted long. The trouble came up the supply road, the way trouble always did. Not on a gray horse this time. On the lips of the freight men who hauled goods north as the roads opened. They brought word of a sickness in the seed, not in the valley, farther off in the places where most of the planting stock came from. Some blight had moved through the stored seed over the winter, a rot that hollowed it out from the inside, so that what looked like good seed in the sack simply refused to grow when it went in the ground. Whole settlements had planted and watched nothing come up, and the seed that remained, the little that was clean, had tripled in price, and then tripled again, until it was worth more than the land a person would plant it in. The valley heard this news and went quiet with a new kind of fear. Because a valley can survive a hard winter. It had just proven that. But a valley cannot survive a year with nothing to plant. No seed meant no crop. No crop meant no food, and no food stored against the next winter, and no winter the valley could hope to live through after the one it had just barely lived through. For the first time since the town was settled, the people who had laughed at Addie Vance faced a thing far worse than any storm. They faced a spring with nothing to put in the ground. Calder came to the homestead 3 days after the news. He did not ride. Addie saw him from the slope, and the sight of it stopped her where she stood. The man who had always come on his gray horse, looking down from the saddle, was walking, on foot, through the soft thaw mud, like any other man with nowhere higher to stand. It meant something, that walking. She had told Wendell as much, long ago, in a different life. Men rode when they came to speak from above. They walked when they came looking for an answer they did not have. He stopped at the foot of the slope and waited, the way a person waits at a door they are no longer sure they have the right to knock on. Addie came down to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The mud sucked at their boots. The thaw water ran in little threads down the slope between them. The boy's well, Calder said finally. My grandson. The fever broke that night after he ate. He's strong as a colt now, running me ragged. Something almost like a smile touched his hard face, and then fell away. I owe you his life. I know it. I'll know it till the day I die. You owe me nothing, Addie said. A child got fed. That's all. It's not all. He looked down at the mud. You've heard about the seed. I've heard. The whole valley's heard. He drew a breath. There's no clean seed to be had for 100 miles. And what little there is, no one here can pay for. We planted last week, the few of us who had anything left. Half of it won't come up. We all know it. He looked up at her, and there was something naked in his face now, something she had never seen there before. This valley's going to starve, come next winter. Slow, but sure. And there's not a thing my money can do about it. For the first time in my life, there's not a thing my money can do. Addie was quiet. She knew what he had come to ask, and she knew, too, that he did not yet understand what she already had. Calder, she said slowly, do you remember the seed you bought up? Last winter. Every clean seed in this valley. So there'd be nothing for me to plant. He flinched. He made himself hold her eyes. I remember, he said. I'm ashamed of it. I'll be ashamed of it the rest of my... That seed's gone bad too, hasn't it? Addie said. The blight. It got into your stores same as everyone's. Calder's jaw worked. Most of it, he admitted. It's worthless now. All that money, all that cleverness, sacks of rot. Addie nodded slowly, and then she said the thing that would change the whole shape of that valley's future. I never bought seed from anyone, she said. Not all winter. You made sure I couldn't, remember? Every door closed. I remember. So I grew my own, Addie said, and I saved it. Every plant that lived inside that wall, I let some of it go to seed before I ate the rest. The greens, the mustard, the frost beans, the strains old Marin brought me, the ones bred to grow in the cold, in the shade of a stone, by people who had no other choice. She looked at him steadily. I've got a whole winter's worth of seed in that cabin, Calder. Hardy seed, living seed, the kind that doesn't quit. And not one grain of it ever touched a sack that the blight could get into. Calder stared at her. The understanding came over him slowly, the way the thaw came over the valley. Inch by inch. And as it came, the color drained out of his weathered face, and his mouth opened, and no words came. You, he managed, you have clean seed. I have living seed, Addie said. Better than clean. Seed that's already proven it can grow in the worst this valley can throw at it. Calder put a hand against his own chest as if something there had given out. I tried to make sure you'd have nothing to plant, he whispered. I bought up every seed in the valley so you'd starve. And now mine's all rotted in the sack, and the only living seed in 100 miles. Is the seed you tried to keep me from having? Addie finished gently. Yes. For a long moment, Calder could not speak at all. He stood in the thaw mud, the man who had owned half of everything a person could see from the ridge, the man who had tried to break her with patience and certainty and quiet cruelty. And he understood that the very thing he had tried to deny her was now the only thing that could save him, and his grandson, and every soul in that valley. The wheel had turned all the way around, and it had landed, of all places, in the bleeding hands of a 58-year-old woman he had been so certain would die. What do you want? Calder said hoarsely. For the seed. Name it. The debt's nothing. I'll forgive the debt. I'll sign the land over free and clear. I'll give you half of everything Name it. Whatever it is, it's yours. And Addie looked at this broken, desperate man, and she shook her head. I don't want your land, she said. I don't want half of anything. And as for the debt, she reached out, slow, and she took the folded paper that she knew lived in his coat, the paper he had drawn out on his gray horse to threaten her with all those cold months ago. She did not even unfold it. This, she said, stops mattering today. And she handed it back to him. I'll give the valley seed, she said. All it needs, free, every family, as much as they can plant. I'll show them how to save their own from it, so they never have to beg another man for the right to grow their own food again. Calder stared at her. Free, he said, after what this town did to you, after what I did to you. You just give it away. Not give it away, Addie said. Pass it on. There's a difference. She looked up at her wall, at the curve of red stone glowing copper in the morning light. Somebody passed it to me, Calder. An old woman with nothing, who'd carried it her whole life so it wouldn't die. She didn't sell it to me. She made me promise to keep it alive, and to write it down, and to pass it on. That's the only price there ever was, and it's the only price I'll ask of you. She held his eyes. You take the seed for your boy, she said, and then you spend the rest of your days making sure no one in this valley is ever again so poor or so alone that they have to die of a thing somebody 3 doors down already knew how to fix. Calder took the debt paper back in his shaking hand, and then, slowly, deliberately, while she watched, he tore it in 2, and then in 4, and he let the pieces fall into the thaw mud at his feet, where the running water took them and carried them away down the slope, dissolving as they went until there was nothing left of the thing that had been meant to break her. It's done, he said. His voice broke on it. The land's yours, free, and I'll do what you said. Every day I've got left. I swear it. Addie put her hand on his arm. Then it's settled, she said quietly. Now come up to the cabin. You can carry the first sacks of seed down yourself. Folks ought to see whose back it came off of. What happened after that spread through the valley slowly, and then everywhere at once. Addie gave the seed. Family by family, they came up the slope, the same path beaten through the thaw mud that had been beaten through the snow. And she met each one at the stone gate, and she pressed living seed into their hands, and she would not take a coin for any of it. But she gave them more than seed. She gave them the knowing. She sat with them, one family at a time, and she showed them how to plant the hardy strains, and how to let a portion go to seed each year so they would never run dry, and how to read the wind, and where the warmth hid in stone after the sun went down. And then she showed them the wall. She walked them through the curve of it, and she explained how it broke the wind and held the heat, and made a small, still pocket of warmth in the dead heart of the cold. She did not pretend it was simple. She showed them her failures too. The frozen frames, the cracked channel, the single sprout that had been all that survived. It's not magic, she told them. It's just paying attention to the things most folks are too busy, or too scared, or too proud to notice. And the valley listened. By the time the real warmth came, something had begun to rise across that whole basin. Walls, curved walls of stone, small at first, behind cabins and beside gardens, half circles built to catch the southeastern sun the way hers did. Crude versions of the thing she had bled to build. Some of them worked well. Some of them barely worked at all the first year. But they tried. The whole valley tried. Even Boone built one, a half-moon of stone behind his barn, built with his own hands and the hands of his recovered daughter, who hauled the smaller rocks and laughed while she did it, strong and pink-cheeked and alive. He came to Addie before he started, hat in his hands, and asked if she would look at his plans. She did. She fixed 2 things he had gotten wrong, and praised the 3rd thing he had gotten right, and she never once mentioned the slope, or the grave, or the laughter. Some debts a person doesn't collect, she just lets the water carry them away. Through all of it, Marin grew quieter. Addie noticed the way she noticed everything. The old woman had been a steady, sharp-eyed presence all winter, but now, with the valley rising into spring, she seemed to be folding inward, slowing, spending more and more of her time at the foot of the cliff, her eyes on something only she could see. One soft evening, near dusk, Addie found her there. Marin did not turn, but she knew Addie had come. "It's done," the old woman said. "What I came back to see, it's done." Addie sat down beside her, on a flat, warm stone at the base of the cliff. "The valley's planting your people's seed," Addie said gently. "Half this basin's going to eat this winter because of the knowing you carried. You did that, Marin. You. 60 years of moving cold place to cold place, refusing to let it die. And it didn't die. It lived. It's growing in every garden from here to the ridge." Marin's old face moved. "I used to think I'd failed them," she said. Her voice was very soft. "My people. I walked off this land a child, and I told myself I should have. I don't know. Saved them. Done something. A child telling herself she should have saved them all." She shook her head slowly. "I carried that longer than I carried the seed." "It wasn't yours to carry," Addie said. "No," Marin agreed. "I see that now, sitting here, watching this." She turned finally and looked at Addie, and her eyes were wet and clear and at peace. "They didn't die because they were foolish. They died because they were first, because no one had figured it out yet, and because there was no one to tell them." Her cracked hand found Addie's and held it. "But it's figured out now, and it's written down, and it'll never be lost again, will it? Never again." "Never again," Addie promised. "I gave you my word." Marin nodded slowly. She looked up at the cliff, copper and warm in the last light, the same cliff her family had looked at a lifetime ago, with cold and hungry hope. "Then I can rest," she said simply. Addie did not understand that evening all that the old woman meant, but she understood it a few mornings later, when she went out to the lean-to with a cup of something hot, the way she did every morning now, and found Marin gone. Not gone away, just gone. She had passed in the night, in her sleep, peaceful, her face turned toward the cliff. There was no struggle in her, no fear. She had the look of someone who had finally set down a weight she had carried for 60 long years, and laid herself down to rest at last on the very ground where it had all begun. Addie sat with her a long time in the soft morning light. She did not weep, though her eyes were wet, because there was no tragedy in it. There was only the deep, quiet rightness of a circle closing. The child who had walked off that cursed land, who had spent a lifetime refusing to let the knowing die, had walked all the way back to see it live. And it had lived. They buried her at the foot of the cliff, in the warmest spot, the place nearest the stone where the heat lingered longest after dark, where the single sprout had survived the killing cold. The whole valley came. The pastor spoke. Boone stood with his hat over his heart and his daughter's hand in his. Calder wept openly, a thing no one in that valley had ever thought to see. And Addie stood at the head of the grave with her ledger in her two hands. She had brought it on purpose. When the pastor had finished, she did not make a speech. She was not a woman for speeches. She simply held the worn leather book up so they could all see it. There was an old woman, she said, who carried what she knew for 60 years, so it wouldn't die with the people who taught it to her. She gave it to me, and she made me promise 2 things: to keep it alive and to write it down. She opened the ledger, page after page of it, the wind charts and the freeze times and the failures and the fixes, the why of things, written down by lantern light through the longest winter of her life. It's all here, she said. Everything she knew, everything I learned, the whole of it. And it's not going to live in one old woman's head anymore, where one bad winter can take it. It's going to live in this book, and then in another, and another, copied out and passed on, and kept, so that no family in this valley ever again has to die of a thing that the people 3 doors down already know how to fix. She closed the book. That's her grave, she said, nodding to the warm earth at the foot of the cliff. But that's not her monument. She held the ledger to her chest. This is. And the valley understood. The years that came after were good ones, not easy. The valley was never easy, but good. The walls held. The hardy seed spread. Children who would once have gone pale and weak in the long cold months now ate green things through the worst of every winter and grew strong, and never knew there had been a time when such a thing was thought impossible. The ledger was copied, as Addie had promised, first by her own hand, then by others. Young folks in the valley taught their letters partly so they could carry the knowing forward. There were 3 copies, then 5, then more than anyone bothered to count. Kept in different homes, in different hands, so that no single fire, no single fever, no single hard winter could ever take it all. Knowledge, refusing to die. The same stubbornness that had kept one small sprout alive in the killing cold, copied now into a dozen hands, scattered safe across a dozen homes. Calder kept his word. He spent the rest of his days a different man. He never grew warm exactly. That was not in him. But he grew fair. He forgave debts that did not need collecting, and he made sure the families at the edges of the valley, the poorest and the most alone, the kind his old self would have left to the cold, were never left to it again. He and Addie never spoke of the debt paper that the thaw water had carried away. There was no need, and Addie and Wendell grew old, older than they already were, old in the good way, the way that comes when a person has done the thing they were put here to do and can finally rest in the doing of it. They would sit together most evenings on a bench Wendell had built at the foot of the cliff, near the warm stone, near the quiet grave. And they would watch the valley spread out below them in the dying light, and they would count the curved walls. There were so many now, little half-moons of stone behind cabins all across the basin, each one catching the southeastern sun, each one holding a small pocket of warmth against the cold. Smoke rising from the chimneys. Green things growing where the valley had once been so sure that nothing green could grow. A whole world changed. Because one woman everyone had counted out had refused to believe the word too late. "You did all this," Wendell said to her one such evening. His voice was old and soft and full of a wonder that had never worn off. "You know that? All of it. Every wall down there. Every child that ate this winter. You did that." Addie shook her head slowly. "Not alone," she said. She looked at the grave at the foot of the cliff, at the warm stone, at the man beside her. "Nobody does anything that matters alone," she said. "An old woman carried the knowing to me. You believed in me when believing was a foolish thing to do. A whole valley carried the stone in the end. I just..." She searched for the words. I just refused to put it down. That's all I ever did. I refused to put it down." Wendell took her hand, her old, scarred, capable hand, marked forever by the stone she had broken. "That's not all you did," he said quietly, and they sat together as the light went copper on the cliff, the two of them, watching the warmth gather in the stone the way it always had, long after the rest of the valley faded toward the blue-gray dark. And here is the thing worth wondering at the end of it. Long after, when folks in that valley spoke of the curved walls, they did not call them by her name. They simply called them the warm places. And maybe that was the truest measure of her, because she had never set out to be remembered. She had set out to be useful. And in a hard country that told every gray-haired soul the same tired thing: too late, too old, sit down, your season's past. She had answered with stone and seed and a worn leather book, and proved it a lie. A person is never the cold the world decides they are. A person is the warmth they manage to leave behind. In ground they will not live to plant. In hands they will never live to hold. The old woman is gone now, in the way of all stories. But somewhere, in a small valley, the walls still curve toward the morning sun, and the green things still grow. And the warmth she gathered across one long and stubborn life has never once gone cold.